Today marks the 155th anniversary of the official abolition of slavery in the United States. In commemoration of this feat, on June 19th, also known as Juneteenth, Black people across America celebrate. However, I beg you to keep in mind that June 19th, 1865 does not mark the date that slavery ended in the United States, but instead marks the gap in time that many slaves were informed of their freedom. On January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declares that all persons held as slaves are henceforward shall be free. This, however, had little impact on many places in the Deep South, as there were few Union troops to enforce this executive order. It was not until June 19, 1865, that General Gordon Granger rode into Galveston, Texas, and read General Order No. 3, informing an estimated 250,000 enslaved people in the state of Lincoln's proclamation 901 days prior. Just as this official enactment came late to our long tortured people, so too has national recognition of the significance of this day. This late recognition is not by accident either, as celebrations of this unofficial holiday have often been discouraged and even disbanded by authorities. While we are unable to change the events of the past, it is important that we cling to our traditions and history, and that we continue to share them so that those who lost their lives can be appropriately honored. On Juneteenth, we honor the strength and resilience of our ancestors. We celebrate their freedom from slavery and commit to fighting for true freedom, justice, and equality for them, for us, and for our future.
As I was thinking about Juneteenth and the Black Lives Matter movement in relation to the stories about Nantucket's contribution to civil rights, I decided to focus mostly on the Black abolitionists of Nantucket, which is told in the pages of my book, even though the topic is not central to Anna Gardner's biography as a whole. Nantucket, because of its association with the Quakers, is often assumed to have been a welcoming place for Black people. The truth is more complicated. Between the mid-1600s and the late 1700s, some Nantucketers were slave owners, with slaves appearing in deeds and in wills. As the Quakers adopted an increasingly abolitionist stance, members were encouraged to free enslaved people, and Nantucket Quakers were among the first in the world to declare their opposition to slavery. Nantucket's Black community lived outside of town, mainly in a section called New Guinea, in the vicinity of Five Corners. Most of the earliest inhabitants of New Guinea were descendants of the enslaved people. The free Black community grew through local emancipation and through migration, reaching a peak during the heyday of whaling before the Civil War. Although Quakers are associated with abolition, it is a myth that the majority were abolitionists. In fact, outspoken abolitionists who were Quakers, like Anna Gardner and her mother Hannah, were disowned by the Quakers. The African Society is the first recorded abolitionist society on Nantucket, organized in the Black community at least as early as 1829. Its goal was to end slavery and gain equal rights for all. Members held a dinner at the African Meeting House in July 1829. After dinner, it was described, they formed a procession through the streets, accompanied with martial music. Edward J. Pompey was the group secretary. Pompey would later captain a whale ship that sailed out of New Bedford. He returned to Nantucket, invested his money wisely, and became a merchant. White abolitionists were in evidence on Nantucket by the 1830s and organized separate societies for men and women. In 1839, the Nantucket abolitionists voted to join the Garrisonian wing of abolitionism, the more radical wing that supported immediate abolition of slavery with no compensation for the enslavers. The Nantucket chapter was integrated from the start. Edward Pompey is listed as a founding member, although there is no record of other Black members. Although it must be noted that the initial pages where membership is listed are missing from the record book at the NHA Research Library. Anna Gardner was elected as recording secretary, and Edward Pompey was elected as one of the directors. He was an important and full participant of the Nantucket chapter, and his name appears frequently in the minutes. It appears that the Black community maintained a separate abolition society even after 1839, but there was a great deal of cooperation between the groups. As debate on abolition and the rights of Black citizens became increasingly divisive, several halls on Nantucket were closed to their meetings. The group was seen as too volatile and too radical. In 1838, the Athenaeum closed its doors to the abolitionists after 112 subscribers petitioned the board of directors to exclude them. At some point during this time, the Athenaeum went even further by closing its doors to all Black people, not just to abolitionist gatherings. Nathaniel Barney, a leading abolitionist, wrote, "In other words, no colored person may enter the building." Barney, a trustee, boycotted the Athenaeum for approximately 2 years because of the exclusion. Abolitionists on Nantucket submitted many petitions to the Massachusetts State House. The earliest petitions were presented in January 1838. 2 of the petitions opposed the annexation of Texas because it would expand the reach of enslavement. This petition, like the majority of them, appear to have been signed at meetings where race and gender mixed and include the Black and white men and women who led the reform movement during the next few decades. The 5th name on the male side is that of Absalom F. Boston, Nantucket's wealthiest Black citizen. He captained a whaling voyage with an all-Black crew in the 1820s, but left a life at sea for the life of entrepreneurship. His name was followed by 3 whites, Isaac Austin, Cyrus Peirce, and Anna's father, Oliver. Edward Pompey's signature is large and bold, typical for his signature on the petitions. It is the 3rd petition submitted that year, 1838, that is of the most interest. Submitted by Absalom Boston, it was signed exclusively by Black Nantucketers. They requested the state legislature, quote, "immediately to repeal all laws in this state which make any distinction among its inhabitants on account of color." It may be that the petition was submitted that year in response to the Athenaeum's closing its doors. Signers include 5 members of the Cooper family, 4 members of the Boston family, and 3 members of the Ross family, including that of 15-year-old Eunice Ross, who would become a household name in 1840 when she passed the entrance examination to Nantucket High School, but was denied admission because of her color, setting off a 6-year battle to integrate Nantucket's public schools. 1839 saw another flurry of activity, with Nantucketers submitting their largest petition ever. Most impressive were 2 identical petitions organized by the progressive educator Cyrus Peirce and his wife Harriet Coffin Peirce. Their petition has a list of demands, including the abolition of the slave trade in Washington, D.C., the abolition of slavery in U.S. territories, and the entire abolition of slavery. Cyrus Peirce's petition included the names of 154 men, but Harriet Peirce's included the names of 616 Nantucket women, a remarkable achievement. As you would expect, the names include Pompey's, Boston, Ross's, and Cooper's, and other members of the Black community. Another petition that year beseeched Massachusetts congressional representatives to vote against annexing Florida, as it would further expand the reach of human bondage. 3 years later, in 1842, 157 Nantucketers petitioned the state legislature to discontinue racial discrimination on the railroads. As with the other petitions, those who signed were Black, white, male, and female. They included the white Barneys, the Black Bostons, the Black Rosses, and the white Gardners, both Anna Gardner, former teacher, and Eunice Ross, her former student. In 1843, the Nantucket abolitionists submitted 2 petitions to strike down the prohibition of marriage between persons of different colors. This one was signed exclusively by Black Nantucketers, 74 in fact. A second petition, identical to it, was submitted by Cyrus Peirce, which included both whites and Blacks, with many of the Black citizens signing both petitions for good measure, including Absalom Boston, James Ross Jr., and Edward Pompey. Because of the refusal of the town to admit Eunice Ross to the Nantucket High School for long years, several petitions were submitted to the State House in 1845. The first was submitted by none other, again, than Edward Pompey and 104 others from the New Guinea community, protesting the denial of equal education to their children on Nantucket. It was followed by 2 petitions supporting the Pompey petition, signed by over 250 white Nantucketers. The 4th petition was submitted by Eunice Ross herself. The legislature took the side of those who argued for equal rights and passed Chapter 214 of the Acts of 1845. The groundbreaking law prohibited discrimination in public schools in Massachusetts and guaranteed equal education to all students, the first law of its kind in the nation. Therefore, it is evident from these few examples I have selected that the Black community on Nantucket was politically active in civil rights.
I'm Amanda Cross, member of the NHA Board of Trustees. I've lived on Nantucket either part or full-time for the past 50+ years. I'm going to read from the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, from the preface given by William Lloyd Garrison. In the month of August 1841, I attended the Anti-Slavery Convention in Nantucket, at which it was my happiness to become acquainted with Frederick Douglass, the writer of the following narrative. He was a stranger to nearly every member of that body, but having recently made his escape from the Southern prison house of bondage, and feeling his curiosity excited to ascertain the principles and measures of the abolitionists, of whom he had heard a somewhat vague description while he was a slave. He was induced to give his attendance on the occasion alluded to, though at the time a resident of New Bedford. Fortunate, most fortunate occurrence, fortunate for the millions of the manacled brethren, yet panting for deliverance for their awful thraldom. Fortunate for the cause of Negro emancipation and of universal liberty. Fortunate for the land of his birth, which he had already done so much to save and bless. Fortunate for the large circle of friends and acquaintances, those whose sympathy and affection he had strongly secured by many of the sufferings he has endured, by his virtuous traits of character, by his ever-abiding remembrance of those who are in bonds, as being bound with them. Fortunate for the multitudes in the various parts of our republic, whose minds he has enlightened on the subject of slavery, and who have been melted to tears by his pathos, or roused to virtuous indignation by his stirring eloquence against the enslavers of men. Fortunate for himself, as it at once brought him into the field of public usefulness, gave the world assurance of a man, quickened the slumbering energies of his soul, and consecrated him to the great work of breaking the rod of the oppressor and letting the oppressed go free. I shall never forget his first speech at the convention, the extraordinary emotion excited in my own mind, the powerful impression it created upon a crowded auditory completely taken by surprise, the applause which followed from the beginning to the end of his felicitous remarks. I think I have never hated slavery so intensely as at that moment. Certainly, my perception of the enormous outrage which inflicted by it on the godlike nature of its victims was rendered far more clear than ever. There stood, in physical proportion and stature, commanding and exact, in intellect richly endowed, in natural eloquence a prodigy, in soul manifestly created but a little lower than the angels, yet a slave, I, a fugitive slave, trembling for his safety. Hardly daring to believe that on American soil, a single white person could be found who could befriend him at all hazards for the love of God and humanity, capable of high attainments as an intellectual and moral being, needing nothing but a comparatively small amount of cultivation to make him an ornament to society and a blessing to his race. By the law of the land, by the voice of the people, by the terms of the slave code, he was only a piece of property, a beast of burden, chattel, personal, nevertheless.
Hello, my name is Carter Stewart. I am a trustee of the Nantucket Historical Association. My family has been coming to Nantucket since 1926, when my great-grandfather, who was a postman in Philadelphia, built a summer cottage on Mill Hill. I'm now going to read excerpts from the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. I was born in Tuckahoe, near Hillsborough, and about 12 miles from Easton in Talbot County, Maryland. I have no accurate knowledge of my age, never having seen any authentic record containing it. By far, the larger part of the slaves know as little of their ages as horses know of theirs, and it is the wish of most masters within my knowledge to keep their slaves thus ignorant. I do not remember to have ever met a slave who could tell of his birthday. They seldom come nearer to it than planting time, harvest time, cherry time, springtime, or fall time. A want of information concerning my own was a source of unhappiness to me even during childhood. The white children could tell their ages. I could not tell why I ought to be deprived of the same privilege. I was not allowed to make any inquiries of my master concerning it. He deemed all such inquiries on the part of the slave improper and impertinent, and evidence of a restless spirit. The nearest estimate I can give makes me now between 27 and 28 years of age. I come to this from hearing my master say sometime during 1835. I was about 17 years old. My mother was named Harriet Bailey. She was the daughter of Isaac and Betsy Bailey, both colored and quite dark. My mother was of a darker complexion than either my grandmother or grandfather. My father was a white man. He was admitted to be such by all I ever heard speak of my parentage. The opinion was also whispered that my master was my father, but of the correctness of this opinion, I know nothing. The means of knowing was withheld from me. My mother and I were separated when I was but an infant, before I knew her as my mother. It is a common custom in the part of Maryland from which I ran away to part children from their mothers at a very early age. Frequently, before the child has reached its 12th month, its mother is taken from it and hired out on some farm a considerable distance off, and the child is placed under the care of an old woman too old for field labor. For what this separation is done, I do not know, unless it be to hinder the development of the child's affection towards its mother, and to blunt and destroy the natural affection of the mother for the child. This is the inevitable result. I never saw my mother, to know her as such, more than 4 or 5 times in my life, and each of these times was very short in duration and at night. She was hired by a Mr. Stewart, who lived about 12 miles from my home. She made her journeys to see me in the night, traveling the whole distance on foot after the performance of her day's work. She was a field hand, and a whipping is the penalty of not being in the field at sunrise, unless a slave has special permission from his or her master to the contrary, a permission which they seldom get, and one that gives to him that gives it the proud name of being a kind master. I do not recollect of ever seeing my mother by the light of day. She was with me in the night. She would lie down with me and get me to sleep, but long before I waked, she was gone. Very little communication ever took place between us. Death soon ended what little we could have while she lived, and with it her hardships and suffering. She died when I was about 7 years old on one of my master's farms near Lee's Mill. I was not allowed to be present during her illness, at her death, or burial. She was gone long before I knew anything about it. Never having enjoyed to any considerable extent her soothing presence, her tender and watchful care, I received the tidings of her death with much the same emotions I should have probably felt at the death of a stranger. Called thus suddenly away, she left me without the slightest intimation of who my father was. The whisper that my master was my father may or may not be true, and true or false, it is of but little consequence to my purpose, whilst the fact remains, in all its glaring odiousness, that slaveholders have ordained, and by law established, that the children of slave women shall in all cases follow the condition of their mothers. And this is done too obviously to administer to their own lusts, and make a gratification of their wicked desires profitable as well as pleasurable. For by this cunning arrangement, the slaveholder, in cases not a few, sustains to his slaves the double relation of master and father.
Hello, my name is Marissa Smith-Jones, and I am a staff member here at the NHA. I have lived here with my immediate family for most of my life since near infancy. I graduated from the Nantucket High School and studied at the Rochester Institute of Technology before coming back here to the island. And today I will be reading from page 39 of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. I was now about 12 years old, and the thought of being a slave for life began to bear heavily upon my heart. Just about this time, I got a hold of a book entitled The Columbian Orator. Every opportunity I got, I used to read this book. Among much of other interesting matter, I found in it a dialogue between a master and his slave. The slave was represented as having run away from his master 3 times. Dialogue represented the conversation which took place between them when the slave was retaken the 3rd time. In this dialogue, the whole argument in behalf of slavery was brought forward by the master, all of which was disposed of by the slave. The slave was made to say some very smart as well as impressive things in reply to his master, things which had the desired, though unexpected, effect. For the conversation resulted in the voluntary emancipation of the slave on the part of the master. In the same book, I met with one of Sheridan's mighty speeches on and in behalf of Catholic emancipation. These were choice documents to me. I read them over and over again with unabated interest. They gave tongue to interesting thoughts of my own soul, which had frequently flashed through my mind and died away for want of utterance. The moral which I gained from the dialogue was the power of truth over the conscience of even a slaveholder. What I got from Sheridan was a bold denunciation of slavery and a powerful vindication of human rights. The reading of these documents enabled me to utter my thoughts and to meet the arguments brought forward to sustain slavery. But while they relieved me of one difficulty, they brought on another even more painful than the one of which I was relieved. The more I read, the more I was led to abhor and detest my enslavers. I could regard them in no other light than a band of successful robbers who had left their homes and gone to Africa and stolen us from our homes, and in a strange land reduced us to slavery. I loathed them as being the meanest as well as the most wicked of men. As I read and contemplated the subject, behold, that very discontentment which would follow my learning to read had already come. That very discontentment which Master Hugh had predicted would follow my learning to read had already come, to torment and sting my soul to unutterable anguish. As I writhed under it, I would at times feel that learning to read had been a curse rather than a blessing. It had given me a view of my wretched condition, without the remedy. It opened my eyes to the horrible pit, but to no ladder upon which to get out. In moments of agony, I envied my fellow slaves for their stupidity. I have often wished myself a beast. I preferred the condition of the meanest reptile to my own. Anything, no matter what, to get rid of thinking. It was this everlasting thinking of my condition that tormented me. There was no getting rid of it. It was pressed upon me by every object within sight or hearing, animate or inanimate. The silver trump of freedom had roused my soul to eternal wakefulness. Freedom now appeared to disappear, no more, forever. It was heard in every sound and seen in everything. It was ever present to torment me with a sense of my wretched condition. I saw nothing without seeing it. I heard nothing without hearing it, and felt nothing without feeling it. It looked from every star. It smiled in every calm, breathed in every wind, and moved in every storm. I often found myself regretting my own existence and wishing myself dead. And but for the hope of being free, I have no doubt but that I should have killed myself, or done something for which I should have been killed. While in this state of mind, I was eager to hear anyone speak of slavery. I was a ready listener. Every little while, I could hear something about the abolitionists. It was some time before I found what the word meant. It was always used in such connections as to make it an interesting word to me. If a slave ran away and succeeded in getting clear, or if a slave killed his master, set fire to a barn, or did anything very wrong in the mind of a slaveholder, it was spoken of as the fruit of abolition. Hearing the word in this connection very often, I set about learning what it meant. The dictionary afforded me little or no help. I found it was the act of abolishing. But then I did not know what was to be abolished. Here I was perplexed. I did not dare to ask anyone about its meaning, for I was satisfied that it was something they wanted me to know very little about. After a patient waiting, I got one of our city papers, containing an account of the number of petitions from the North, praying for the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia, and of the slave trade between the states. From this time, I understood the words abolition and abolitionist, and always drew near when that word was spoken, expecting to bear something of importance to myself and fellow slaves. The light broke in upon me by degrees. I went one day down on the wharf of Mr. Waters, and seeing two Irishmen unloading a scow of stone, I went unasked and helped them. When we had finished, one of them came to me and asked if I were a slave. I told him I was. He asked, "Are you a slave for life?" I told him that I was. The good Irishman seemed to be deeply affected by the statement. He said to the other that it was a pity so fine a little fellow as myself should be a slave for life. He said it was a shame to hold me. They both advised me to run away to the North, that I should find friends there, and that I should be free. I pretended not to be interested in what they said, and treated them as if I did not understand them, for I feared they might be treacherous. White men have been known to encourage slaves to escape, and then, to get the reward, catch them and return them to their masters. I was afraid that these seemingly good men might use me so, but nevertheless, I remembered their advice, and from that time, I resolved to run away. I looked forward to a time at which it would be safe for me to escape. I was too young to think of doing so immediately. Besides, I wished to learn how to write, as I might have occasion to write my own past. I consoled myself with the hope that I should one day find a good chance. Meanwhile, I would learn to write.
I'm Kelly Williams, President of the Board of Trustees of the Nantucket Historical Association. I found employment the third day after my arrival in New Bedford in stowing a sloop with a load of oil. It was new, dirty, and hard work for me, but I went at it with a glad heart and a willing hand. I was now my own master. It was a happy moment, the rapture of which can be understood only by those who have been slaves. It was the first work, the reward of which was to be entirely my own. There was no Master Hugh standing ready the moment I earned the money to rob me of it. I worked that day with a pleasure I had never before experienced. I was at work for myself, a newly married wife. It was to me the starting point of a new existence. When I got through with that job, I went in pursuit of a job of caulking. But such was the strength of prejudice against color among the white caulkers that they refused to work with me. And of course, I could get no employment. Finding my trade of no immediate benefit, I threw off my caulking habiliments and prepared myself to do any kind of work I could get to do. Mr. Johnson kindly let me have his wood horse and saw, and I very soon found myself a plenty of work. There was no work too hard, none too dirty. I was ready to saw wood, shovel coal, carry the hod, sweep the chimney, or roll oil casks. all of which I did for nearly 3 years in New Bedford before I became known to the anti-slavery world. In about 4 months after I went to New Bedford, there came a young man to me and inquired if I did not wish to take the Liberator. I told him I did, but having just made my escape from slavery, I remarked that I was unable to pay for it then. I, however, finally became a subscriber to it. The paper came, and I read it from week to week with such feelings as it would be quite idle for me to attempt to describe. The paper became my meat and my drink. My soul was set all on fire. Its sympathy for my brethren in bonds, its scathing denunciations of slaveholders, its faithful exposures of slavery, and its powerful attacks upon the upholders of the institution sent a thrill of joy through my soul such as I had never felt before. I had not long been a reader of the Liberator before I got a pretty correct idea of the principles, measures, and spirit of the anti-slavery reform. I took right hold of the cause. I could do but little, but what I could, I did with a joyful heart, and never felt happier than when in an anti-slavery meeting. I seldom had much to say at the meetings, because what I wanted to say was said so much better by others. But while attending an anti-slavery convention at Nantucket on the 11th of August, 1841, I felt strongly moved to speak, and was at the same time much urged to do so by Mr. William C. Coffin, a gentleman who had heard me speak in the Colored People's Meeting at New Bedford. It was a severe cross, and I took it up reluctantly. The truth was, I felt myself a slave, and the idea of speaking to white people weighed me down. I spoke but a few moments when I felt a degree of freedom and said what I desired with considerable ease. From that time until now, I have been engaged in pleading the cause of my brethren. With what success and with what devotion, I leave those acquainted with my labors to decide.
I am now going to read the Emancipation Proclamation. By the President of the United States of America, a proclamation. Whereas on the 22nd day of September, in the year of our Lord 1862, a proclamation was issued by the President of the United States containing, among other things, the following, to wit, that on the first day of January, in the year of our Lord 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do no act or acts to oppress such persons, or any of them, in any efforts they make for their actual freedom. That the executive will, on the first day of January, aforesaid by proclamation, designate the states and parts of states, if any, in which the people thereof, respectively, shall then be in rebellion against the United States, and the fact that any state or the people thereof shall on that day be, in good faith, represented in the Congress of the United States by members chosen thereto at elections wherein a majority of the qualified voters of such state shall have participated, shall, in the absence of strong countervailing testimony, be deemed conclusive evidence that such state and the people thereof are not then in rebellion against the United States. Now therefore I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of the power in me vested as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States in time of actual armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, and as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, due on this first day of January in the year of our Lord 1863, and in accordance with my purpose, so do publicly proclaim for the full period of 100 days from the day first above mentioned, order and designate as the states and parts of states wherein the people thereof respectively are this day in rebellion against the United States the following, to wit, and by virtue of the power and for the purpose aforesaid, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are and henceforward shall be free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons. And I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence, unless in necessary self-defense. And I recommend to them that, in all cases when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. And I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed services of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service. And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution, upon military necessity, I invoke the considerable judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God. In witness whereof, I have hereunto set my hand and caused the seal of the United States to be affixed, done at the city of Washington, this first day of January, in the year of our Lord, 1863, and of the independence of the United States of America, the 87th, by the President, Abraham Lincoln.